Ethan Grayson walked into the courtroom as if he owned the place. His impeccable Italian suit contrasted with the bored expression on his face. To him, this hearing was nothing more than a trivial nuisance, something that would soon be settled with a few phone calls and a well-written check. He wasn't in a hurry. In fact, he thought the whole situation was a joke. As he walked down the hallway toward his seat, he flashed an arrogant smile at the reporters squeezing behind the cameras, whispering headlines about the billionaire, mogul about to be judged. He sat down with an exaggerated sigh, adjusting his gold cufflinks and crossing his legs with practiced elegance. His lawyers whispered among themselves, but Ethan seemed utterly uninterested. He stared at the ceiling for a moment, then pulled out his phone and started swiping the screen, ignoring the tension building in the room. When the judge entered, everyone stood in respect, except for him. He remained seated, texting as if he were far more important than anyone in the room. "Mr. Grayson," the firm voice echoed through the courtroom. He took his time to look up, sighing as if interrupted. From something far more important than the trial itself. When he finally met Judge Monica Lee's gaze, he gave a smirk. "Oh, is it my turn now?" he asked, his tone dripping with irony. The judge narrowed her eyes but maintained her composure. "Stand up," she ordered. Ethan raised an eyebrow, as if it were a suggestion, not an order. Slowly, he stretched his legs, stood up, and put his hands in his suit pockets. "Satisfied?" he taunted, throwing a dismissive glance. The judge ignored his provocation. She picked up a paper from the desk and began reading off the crimes he was being charged with: large-scale fraud, investment manipulation, embezzlement, misappropriation of millions of dollars, and the destruction of hundreds of families. Each word should have hit like a sentence, but Ethan discreetly yawned and shifted his legs, impatient. When Monica Lee finished, he simply smiled. "Can we get to the point, Your Honor? I have a jet waiting," he said in a mocking tone, causing a murmur to ripple through the courtroom. The judge calmly set the papers down and folded her hands on the desk. She looked directly at him, not blinking, showing no sign of irritation. Then she responded with surgical coldness. "The only flight you'll be taking is to your cell, Mr. Grayson." The silence in the courtroom was immediate. For the first time, Ethan's smile faltered. Judge Monica Lee was not someone who could be impressed by wealth or power, and in that moment it was clear he wouldn't control this situation the way he always had. Ethan Grayson wasn't used to being challenged. His empire had been built on manipulation, lies, and above all, absolute power. He always got what he wanted: bribed judges, politicians in his pocket, lawyers who could turn even the most blatant crimes into mere bureaucratic misunderstandings. But when he heard Judge Monica Lee's response, he felt something rare, a slight discomfort. He quickly recovered. Smiling smugly, he leaned over the table and looked at the judge as if he were dealing with a stubborn employee who just needed to be adjusted to his game. "I sure know how to talk, Your Honor," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "But let's be honest, everyone has a price." The room held its breath. Ethan's lawyers exchanged tense glances, one of them wiping sweat from his brow with a handkerchief. The prosecution remained stoic, but some members of the jury furrowed their brows in indignation. Monica Lee, however, didn't even blink. "Are you implying this court can be bought, Mr. Grayson?" Her voice was calm, cutting like a sharp blade. Ethan chuckled softly, adjusted his tie, and leaned back in his chair. "I'm saying this. Whole theater is a waste of time. At the end of the day, we know how things work. Powerful people don't go to jail." The judge studied him for a moment, as if observing an exotic animal displaying its predictable behavior. Then she leaned slightly forward. "Mr. Grayson, your problem isn't just your lack of ethics. Your problem is your conviction that nothing can touch you. But believe me, justice does not bow to arrogance." Ethan laughed again, this time louder, shaking his head. "What a nice speech. Are you really telling me you believe in this broken system? Because I guarantee, Your Honor, half the people in this room would love to be in my position. The rich don't go to prison. It's that simple." This time, the judge didn't respond immediately. She simply picked up a pen and made a subtle note. The gesture was simple, but somehow it sent a chill down Ethan's spine. "Shall we continue?" The prosecutor interrupted, standing up with a folder full of documents. "We have plenty of evidence to present." The judge nodded for him to proceed. Ethan rolled his eyes and pulled out his phone, completely ignoring the session as if he were bored. What he didn't know, or perhaps didn't want to admit, was that every move he made in that courtroom was only making his downfall even more inevitable. Ethan Grayson drummed his fingers on the table, impatient. While the prosecution's lawyers displayed documents, recordings, and testimonies, he rolled his eyes, sighed loudly, and checked his phone as if he were in some pointless meeting. None of it truly worried him. He had gotten out of worse situations before. The defense, made up of the best lawyers money could buy, tried to undermine the credibility of the witnesses. They argued that the investors had known the risks, that the contracts were clear, that it was all just poor management and bad market luck. But then came the blow Ethan hadn't expected. "Your Honor," the prosecutor said, lifting a tablet, "I'd like to present new evidence. Internal emails exchanged by the defendant, detailing the deliberate intention to deceive investors." Ethan's lawyers exchanged tense looks. He, on the other hand, smiled indifferently. "Emails? Pfft, so what?" he murmured loud enough for the judge to hear. The prosecutor hit play on one of the audio files attached to the emails. Ethan's voice echoed through the courtroom. "Of course it's a scam. The problem isn't deceiving them, it's keeping the show going until the last round. After that, well, it's no longer my problem." The words hung in the air like a punch to the stomach. The silence was immediate. Some victims in the audience exchanged stunned glances. An elderly woman in the front row covered her mouth, her eyes welling with tears. Ethan furrowed his brow. For a moment his unshakable confidence wavered, but soon he leaned back and laughed. "That doesn't prove anything. It's just business talk," he scoffed. Judge Monica Lee adjusted her glasses and looked directly at him. Her voice was firm but calm. "The only thing that this audio doesn't prove, Mr. Grayson, is that you feel any shame for what you've done." The courtroom erupted in murmurs. The defense lawyers whispered frantically, trying to find an escape. But the damage had been done. For the first time, Ethan realized that the game was no longer in his control, and for the first time a real discomfort began to grow within him. What happened next was something Ethan Grayson couldn't simply ignore. He hadn't expected the victims to appear so soon. He didn't expect that after so many years of manipulation, sitting high on his pedestal, he would be directly confronted by those whose lives he had destroyed. The courtroom filled with a palpable tension when the first victim took the witness stand. He was an elderly man, his face worn and hands trembling. He approached the microphone hesitantly, as if forcing each word out. "My name is Henry Willis. I lost everything. My home, my retirement, my dignity. I trusted in a peaceful future. You know? But one day my phone rang, and it was the beginning of the end." The man ran his hand through his graying hair and forced himself to continue. Ethan Grayson promised me that the investments were safe. He told me I could withdraw my money whenever I needed it. I was a fool, I believed him, and in the end, all that was left was an empty account and a place I couldn't live in anymore. Henry looked at Ethan, who was lounging in his chair, seemingly bored. The elderly man's eyes were teary, but his voice, though shaky, was full of genuine pain. "I wanted to believe he'd do something to make it right, but he never cared about us." Ethan shrugged and fiddled with his phone again. To him, it was nothing but a performance of an old victim trying to garner the sympathy of the court. "This is a show," he muttered to his lawyers, but the judge, paying no mind to his words, gave him an unyielding look. "Mr. Grayson," she said calmly, "do not be disrespectful." As Henry left the witness stand, a woman stepped up. She appeared younger, her eyes red and hands crossed in front of her. Her name was Carla. She was a mother of 2 young children, and what she had to say was even more devastating. "I lost my job, my home, because of this man. I was a small investor, just trying to give my kids a better future. And he destroyed all of it." Carla spoke with a quiet strength, but her eyes showed deep, raw pain. Ethan Grayson destroyed lives. Not just numbers. He destroyed families. She looked directly at him, her voice trembling with anger. "And you don't deserve a minute of peace." This time Ethan didn't laugh. He looked at her, and for a brief moment his gaze dropped to the floor, but soon he composed himself, looking at his defense team as if he were already tired of hearing these stories. Enough, all right? I get the point. You can continue with this comedy. But what he didn't realize was that by sneering at that pain, he was only digging himself deeper. Each word from those victims he tried to ignore pushed him further into the reality of who he really was. A man with no escape, no mercy, condemned not only for the crimes he committed, but for his utter disregard for the lives he had destroyed, and yet even with the room filled with sorrow, Ethan remained unshaken, at least until his own arrogance began to turn against him. The courtroom was packed, and the air felt thick. The victims, the jurors, the lawyers, and even the journalists sat in silence, as if they were all waiting for the exact moment that would follow. Ethan Grayson, still maintaining his indifferent posture, leaned back in his chair, but now his shoulders were tense. He glanced from side to side, clearly bothered by the events of the past hours. Judge Monica Lee had orchestrated every step flawlessly, and he was beginning to realize there was nothing more he could do to escape reality. Monica Lee entered the room once again, and everyone stood. She walked slowly to her desk, adjusted her glasses, and looked at Ethan with an unyielding expression. This time he didn't challenge her. There was no room for sarcasm anymore. The judge looked at the documents in front of her, paused, and then, with the same calm she had maintained throughout the trial, declared, "Ethan Grayson, for your crimes of fraud, investment manipulation, embezzlement, and the diversion of millions of dollars, you have been found guilty." The words fell like a bomb, and even though he knew the conviction was inevitable, something inside his chest seemed to freeze. He swallowed hard, his eyes still locked on Monica Lee. He tried to remain composed, but his expression was no longer the same. His usual confidence was disintegrating before his eyes. "Mr. Grayson, the sentence is 25 years in prison, without the possibility of parole. Furthermore, all of your assets will be liquidated to compensate the victims." The courtroom buzzed with murmurs. Some people started to applaud, while others exchanged looks of disbelief. But the most striking reaction was Ethan's. For a moment, he stood still, as if the judge's words hadn't registered in his mind. Then his lips curled into a look of pure rage. "You're doing this?" he shouted, standing up from his chair. "You're going to destroy me? I am Ethan Grayson. I have money. I have power. You don't know who you're judging." The judge remained unflinching, watching him with the same serenity as always. "I know exactly who you are, Mr. Grayson, and what is being judged here is not your money. It is your humanity." Ethan lunged toward the desk, trying to approach the judge, but he was immediately stopped by security, who held him firmly. His arrogance, which had accompanied him throughout his life, now seemed like a dead weight. The man who thought he was invincible was being dragged into the reality of his downfall. As he was escorted out of the room, his face contorted in a mix of fury and desperation. There was no escape left. The man who had destroyed so many lives with a smile now found himself reduced to a prisoner, his freedom and his fortune crumbling before his eyes. The room erupted in applause, not for the conviction itself, but for the fact that at last someone had brought down the empire of Ethan Grayson. Justice had finally been served, and Monica Lee, with her firm gaze and unshakable posture, watched as justice took its course. She knew that, in the end, this moment would be the beginning of something far more important than any amount of money. She wasn't there just to deliver justice. She was there to teach him, and all the others who thought they were above the law, that no one is immune from the consequences of their actions. Ethan Grayson was no longer the man who had walked into that courtroom weeks ago. The arrogance that had once defined him now felt like a distant memory, a relic of the past he could no longer sustain. He was in his prison cell, in the correctional system, and the silence around him felt more oppressive than any sound he had ever heard in his life. The grand mansion, the yachts, the private jets, all of that now seemed like a far-off memory. That afternoon, a prison officer entered and handed him a letter. Ethan's face revealed no emotion, but the heart of someone who had once had everything seemed to grow heavier with each passing day. He took the paper almost reluctantly and read it with his eyes lowered. It was a letter from the victims he had destroyed. "Mr. Grayson, we know you don't care about the pain you've caused, but we're writing to remind you that no matter how much you've tried to escape responsibility, there are people who will live with the scars of what you did. Yes, we allowed ourselves to be deceived, but we will never forget what you took from us. Now justice is all we have left. We hope that at the very least you can reflect on what you've lost." The words were simple and direct, something Ethan could no longer ignore. He placed the letter on the table and sat on the bed, his mind finally quiet, a state he rarely experienced. He had always known that one day the consequences would catch up to him, but he had never imagined it would happen like this. The realization that what he had feared most had come to pass. He, the man who had once considered himself invincible, now cast into the darkness of prison, struck him like a physical blow. Still, he clung to the remnants of his pride. "I can still get out of this," he thought, but the idea felt hollow. Even he, with all the money he had once possessed, knew that true freedom was not something that could be bought. As the sun set on the horizon, casting long shadows on the cold walls of his cell, Ethan recalled one of the speeches he had given. During his career, power is everything, money is everything, control is everything. He had always believed that. But now, feeling the weight of solitude and the consequences, he knew that truth was, at best, an illusion. The last image in his mind before he fell asleep was that of the courtroom, the sound of applause echoing in his ears. He tried to deny it, but he knew that moment would mark his life forever. No matter how many resources he had, the verdict had been delivered. Justice, though delayed, had been served. And as difficult as it was, he began to accept the fact that, in the end, everyone is responsible for their actions. He was no longer the man who controlled the fate of others. Now he was the one in the hands of justice, and that he could not change. Omini.